Hello, friends, and welcome to a Chabura public question and answer session with our beloved Rosh Bet Midrash, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, who will be answering questions which were submitted by all of you, our members. Before we start, I want to publicly remind everyone to get a copy of our new book, Truth from All Sources, which looks as a translation of Rabbi Ben Moseg's response to his book being excommunicated. It's translated by the one and only Simon Montague. I think he's over here somewhere. Chazaka for that, and stay tuned for all of our upcoming publications. With that said, thank you all for being here live, all those who are going to be watching afterwards, and thank you, Rabbi, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, beloved Rav Ohad. We love you. All right, thank you very much for your hosting the Q&A tonight, and thank you all for being online, listening to Q&A, and for those who will be listening later. And most of all, thank you for your questions. I must say, this round of questions was excellent questions. I mean, all of them, really. Excellent questions. So I will try to, not that the others are not excellent questions, but this particular batch was like really, yeah, good ones. So I'm going to try to answer as many of them as I can. I think we've got about 25 questions or something like that, which if I were to spend 5 minutes on, we'd be here for 2 hours. So I don't know that I'm going to spend 5 minutes on all of them. I may spend more on some and some short answers on others. We'll see how much we get through. If we don't get through all of them, we'll do another Q&A to finish the rest of them shortly, right? So in the next few days, maybe on a Sunday or something of that nature, because I do think they're important and we'll get through them. So without further ado, let's get started. In no particular order. The first question is from London, England. Why are Retzeh and Sim Shalom in the Hoda'ah section of the Amidah when it appears only Modim actually addresses the matter of thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu? That's a good question. That's a question that I've heard before. The answer to that, I think, is relatively simple. When we talk about like a section of the Amidah being Hoda'ah, we really are only talking about Modim. We're not talking about Retzeh and Sim Shalom. Retzeh and Sim Shalom are like a coda, right? They've been attached on to the very end like a capstone to the entire Amidah. So Modim is the final beracha that is essentially thanking, and of course it is replete with thanks, and ends Hatov Shimcha Ulechana Ele Odot. Retzeh is a request for the tefillah simply to be accepted, right? So it's not in the sense of, asking for specific details in tefillah the way that we do for the rest of the tefillah. Retzeh is simply asking for the tefillah to be accepted. It's asking for korbanot to resume so that the full avodah is reinstated. And Sim Shalom is shalom, right? Shalom. Yeah, which basically is that we're asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu to just bring us shalom on all of Klal Yisrael. So I think the fact that those are attached, it's not meant to rigidly mean that those somehow have to be, shoehorned into the concept of Hoda'ah. They're not. They're not really elements of Hoda'ah. They are capstones. They're codas, endings of the entire tefillah that essentially closes with the Hoda'ah of Modim. So those two barachot are essentially added for that. I hope that explains that. Question from Miami, Florida. If Maimonides clearly states that he saw it fit not to write books explaining the cryptic Agadot of the Hakamim, what are we to take from that in light of the myriad such books and recorded classes today which discuss such topics? Is it advisable that we write such things? Have the times changed and now require it? Good question. So first of all, I don't know that there are myriad books, that do this. Maybe there are. I just don't know about them. There are, I suppose, some books on Midrash. I think that recorded classes are a little bit different because it's one thing if the goal of a book, or for that matter, a series of classes, is just to explain Midrashim, right? To go through all the Midrashim and say, this is what this Midrash means, this is what that Midrash means, and so on and so forth. I don't think that anything has changed from the time of Harambam till now with regards to that, and I think that it's a poor thing to do. It's a bad idea. There is Harambam wrote, he was going to write such a book, and in the beginning of the morning, well, first of all, in the Hakdama to Perek Helek, he writes, I'm going to write this book, right, which explains all of the Midrashim, or the major ones that are difficult. And then the beginning of the Moreh Nebuchim, he says, I thought about it from my 30s. He was basically 30 years old, maybe younger, when he wrote that in the Pirush Mishnah. And he said, look, I thought about it and I realized it's a bad idea. And the reason it's a bad idea is because I'm not helping anything that the Hachamim did. I mean, the Hachamim were obscure about these things for a reason. And all I would be doing is removing that obscurity and it wouldn't help anything. So I changed my mind. He says, and I'm not doing it. Instead, what I'm doing is writing the Moreh Nebuchim, right? Why was the Moreh Nebuchim helpful? The Moreh Nebuchim was helpful because if a person studies the Moreh Nebuchim appropriately and understands the Moreh Nebuchim appropriately, which is not an easy thing to do, they have the tools to understand the Midrashim. So what Harambam did is, instead of unlocking the door and opening it for people, he gave them keys that if they know how to access, they can open the door themselves, right? They don't have to know how to use the keys, but they can open the door. That's what the Moreh Nebuchim does. So recorded classes are really different. I mean, look, I'm speaking from for myself here, right? I mean, there's, of course, over the years, many midrashim, which I have explained, at least in the best of my understanding of these midrashim, but it never is simply to explain a midrash. I'm always doing it, and this happens with many other hachamim, in the context of teaching something. So I'll be teaching, a sefer in the Tanakh, or I'll be teaching one of the Nebi'im or something of that nature. There's a midrash that the Hachamim wrote on that Nabi, and in the context of learning the Nabi, we unpack the midrash. Why? Because we're in the middle of this study. And so it helps to be able to have a sense of what the theme is, what are we learning here, what are the ideas of the Nabi, and why did the Hachamim write this on this particular Nabi? That's part of the limud itself. So there's nothing wrong with speaking that out and unpacking it and unfolding that particular midrash in the context of that learning. The reason the Hachamim were concerned about presenting the ideas of midrash blatantly and explicitly without obscuring them in riddle was because they felt that people would cheapen these ideas, take advantage of these ideas, completely misunderstand these ideas, ruin the ideas by bringing them into false understandings, which as it is they do with midrashim, right? And so at least they should be doing it in some concealed form rather than the exposed form. It's in a sense a form of tzniut, right? That the people that are able to see what's concealed in terms of tzniut are only people that merit the exposure and the vulnerability of that. And that's what it is. So I don't think anything has changed from the time of Rambam till now. I don't think anything needs to be done differently. It's possible that some of the concepts in the midrashim we need, right? In other words, there are things that the Hachamim said that we need to learn, and therefore we need to learn how to learn the midrashim. That's a different issue. But to just write explanations of midrashim and put that in book form or class form, or whatever the case may be, I personally don't see that as advisable. I don't think anything has changed, and I think that Harambam understood and specifically said that that's a bad idea. So I maintain that. Next question comes from Muncie. So Muncie, America, right? It's Muncie, New York, which is in America. This question: how can we understand the sin of David and Bathsheba? I know that there are some statements from Hazal that David didn't sin. It's a Gemara in Shabbat, Nun Vav. But that seems to conflict with the Peshat of the Nabi, which seems to say, of course, that David did sin. And not only did he sin, was punished for it. On the other hand, to say David HaMelech was guilty of such heinous sins is very hard to understand. Could the Rav please give guidance on this episode? Well, I could try. I think that there's an assumption with this question that is the mistake, right? And there's an assumption in this question that is the mistake that the Hachamim essentially addressed. And I've heard this question many, many times before. And that is that you are assuming in this question that the sin was one thing, when in reality it was something else, right? What are you assuming? Again, from my understanding of your question, the very fact that you call it the sin of David and Bathsheba, right? Bathsheba was not punished for this, right? David was punished for this. So it's something that David did, right? Something that David did. Most people read the story and understand it to be the fact that David slept with Bathsheba, first of all. And second of all, that he killed her husband. That is what people see to think the problem is. And so the Gemara uses a phrase, and this is a phrase that's used not just for David, it's used for various other people in Tanakh who seem to have sinned in a particular way. And what the Hachamim are trying to say is it's not that you think was the problem that was the problem. So it says, Kol ha'omer David hata eno ela to'eh. Anyone who says David sinned is only mistaken, right? They're mistaken. What do they mean in saying that? They're saying that if you think that David sinned by sleeping with Bathsheba and killing Uriah Hittite, and that those actions were sinful, you're wrong. Those were not the problem. And the Gemara goes out of its way to show why those were not the problem and that they were not wrong, right? And the Gemara, whatever it is that you want to say about the Gemara, the Hachamim very clearly say that she was not an Eshet Ish at the time, and Uriah Hittite was Mored b'Malchut, right? So he was absolutely, according to law, committing capital crime by essentially behaving in a way that was treasonous, and Bathsheba was not an Eshet Ish because, as the Gemara says, that in the wars of David, everybody wrote Gittin to their wives before they went out to war. That's how the Hachamim, that's the line the Hachamim take. Right? So then the question remains, why was David punished? And the answer is because the sin that people say David made was not those things. He did something much worse. What he did that was much worse was Chilul Hashem. And that's explicit in the Pasuk. Right? You can't take it out. As a matter of fact, it's the one thing that the Pasuk keeps repeating over and over and over again. Right? I'll read it to you. And the Gemara recognizes what you're saying, by the way, about the fact that how could David HaMelech do something so heinous and so on. It says, Vahi David b'chol derechad maskil. Well, they bring that pasuk. But this particular thing was problematic. Why? Because it bordered on Chilul Hashem. And for David, in terms of his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and in terms of the situation as being a king in Am Yisrael, was a terrible problem. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends Natan HaNabi to go speak to David and gives him a whole mashal and says, what would you say in this kind of situation? And David says, whoever was to do such a thing, right, is guilty and ben mavet. So Natan HaNabi says, Atah ha'ish, you're the problem who did this thing, right? And now it's interesting, right? So it says, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu say to him? He says, Madua bazita et devar Adonai la'asot hara be'inav. Right? Et Uriah Hittite hikita b'cherev, et ishto lakachta lecha leisha, ve'oto haragta b'cherev b'nei Ammon. What is it saying over here? Notice, it's not how could you do these horrible things, full stop, A, B, C. It says, how could you bozeh devar Hashem? How could you belittle the word of God? And that was the big problem, that he was bozeh. And so because of that, David HaMelech was punished. And what was he punished with? You're punished that the child that you had, that you conceived with Bathsheba, is not going to live. And he says, I'm going to bring to you Ra'al Betecha, and so on and so forth. There's going to be terrible things that happen with you. And he says again, Ata asita basater. You did all of this privately. I'm going to do this in front of all of Israel, in front of the sun. I'm going to expose you. What is that about? Well, there's a Pirkei Avot that says, anybody who desecrates the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even in private, they take payment for it publicly. And so the issue with this was, you are the king of Israel. The fact that this is technically not prohibited on the books is not the issue. The fact is, you shouldn't be doing this, right? Because the things that you've done look horrible to the people. And you can't do things that look horrible to the people. Do you know why you can't do things that look horrible to the people? Because it makes me look ugly. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying to him. It completely desecrates my name in the world. It utterly is bozeh. Bozeh means completely belittles and scorns my name. And that, David, that's not acceptable. So that's the idea behind the Gemara there. It's saying the thing that you think that David did is not what David did. David did something worse. in terms of that. But that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to deal with and address with him. And it was done even in private. It wasn't something that was necessarily public. It wasn't going to come out in those terms. But should it have, and should people have known about this, would have completely destroyed the entire relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael, and David's representation of that, which is why Rambam posek that when it comes to Hilul Hashem, there is a form of Hilul Hashem that is not related to doing an Isur, but related to who you are. So if a person is recognized to be a person who's Yareh Shamayim, and people know this person to be Yareh Shamayim and learned in Torah and so on and so forth, they are not allowed to do anything that, even if they're technically mutar, is seen by the people. Lashon of Rambam is davar sha'am meranninim harav, the thing that the people make fun of or talk badly about, even if the act itself is not prohibited legally, right? That's considered Hilul Hashem. And so we know that David's relationship with Bathsheba was not problematic in itself, because guess what? Guess who came from that union? Shlomo HaMelech, right? Who ends up becoming the Mashiach Hashem. So it's a serious issue, right? But that's on a very surface level how I would suggest to look at it. All right, next question from Mayim. If you could sit down to lunch with one great figure from the Jewish people's past, who would it be? What questions would you ask? And I think there's no secret to that. I would want to speak to Rambam, but I certainly wouldn't want to sit at lunch with him, because first of all, I'd be embarrassed to eat. I wouldn't be able to eat. I'd be too nervous to eat. I don't think it's very nice to have a conversation with Rambam while we're eating. So it would not be over lunch. I would tell you that. But if I could have an opportunity to speak to anyone, it would likely be him. It would likely be him. And there's a lot of things that I would want to ask him about and talk to him about, and so on and so forth. But, you know, a cute question, but I don't know how practical that is. All right. What do you think about the discussion as to whether or not the hostage videos recorded by Jews on Shabbat are allowed to be watched? And this is a question from Brooklyn. I don't think there's any issue at all watching those videos. All right, I think I'll mention what I think the problem that people have with it is, but I'm not going to get into the details. Ostensibly, the question is there a problem to get any hana'ah from something that a Jewish person did on Shabbat that was prohibited, right? So if something was done that was prohibited, you're allowed to have hana'ah. And the basic answer to that is no, you're not allowed to get hana'ah. First of all, I don't necessarily think that this is what we call hana'ah, but that's not the reason why I would say it was permitted. I think there are other factors here that allow it. But I'm not getting into them now. But in terms of a blanket response, I don't think that there's a problem to watch those videos. I don't think there's any issue with it. I respect that there was a request by one of the parents of the hostages not to take the video because they didn't want that to happen on Shabbat. I recognize that, but I think in terms of us watching those videos, there's no prohibition. Next question. Do you support the increase in popularity of the Yerushalmi? I thought this was a very funny question. This was from Nashville, Tennessee. Where is the increase in popularity of the Yerushalmi? I mean, there must be something trending that I don't know. I didn't know that the Yerushalmi had lost its popularity in any way. But in any case, and then you ask, are there areas where the Yerushalmi is preferable compared to Bavli? So all I can answer you is the basic principle. I mean, look, obviously, what I can tell you is, first of all, Harambam felt that the Yerushalmi was certainly to be paid attention to. And he actually writes that there were times where he followed the Geonim, where he followed the Geonim, and he writes letters to his Talmid. And in it he says, "Ha-Geonim hit'uni." He says the way that the Geonim understood something made me it caused me to make a mistake in my understanding because I followed their reasoning. And Moshe Halbertal writes about this in his book on Harambam, which I think is very valuable. I haven't mentioned this book in a long time, but I will say again, if there is one book on Harambam that you read, let it be that one. I think it's an excellent work. And he writes about this. He writes about the fact that Harambam relied more on the Yerushalmi than he did generally the opinions of the Geonim, and he would go to the Yerushalmi for to determine a halacha on something. As a matter of fact, I'm just thinking now as I'm talking, I have a book on Harambam in Yerushalmi somewhere. But anyway, um, aside from that, there is a general principle that we have because there are situations in which the Talmud Bavli leaves things unresolved. Right, so either it will end in tiku or it'll end in not a clear assertion of halacha, and in those cases, in where the Yerushalmi is very clear on the case, but the Bavli leaves the case undecided, we go like the decision of the Yerushalmi. So lavshevkinan pshuto shel Yerushalmi mi sfeko shel Bavli. Right? We don't push away something that's been clearly established in the Yerushalmi because of a question or doubt with regards to what's in the Bavli. So in general, that's what I would say. But as halacha is concerned, we're not posek like the Yerushalmi in general terms, right? And the Yerushalmi is a very, very different work than Bavli. The Yerushalmi um, presents itself very matter of factly. It simply tells you this is the halacha. It brings you the Mishnah. It says halacha 1, 2, 3, 4. This is our decision on the halacha, and you are left to figure out how it is that they got there, right? But that's not exposed in any way in the Yerushalmi. In the Bavli, they take you on a journey, right? And they walk you through the discussions and the dialogue and the back and forth and the rejections and so on and so forth of how it is that they ultimately come to the halacha. So they're also two very, very different works, right? Two very different works. I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't learn the Yerushalmi, as v'shalom, by all means. But if you have a question of priority, better to learn the Bavli first, because that's really what it is that we go by and what we use as our staple, and why we're hayav to go by. It's because it's the final terms. It's the final decider. The Yerushalmi was written before the Bavli. So we go like Bavli because it's Batra as well. But yeah, but otherwise, by all means, why not learn the Yerushalmi? File next question. Is there an issue of selling, buying aliyot on Shabbat and holidays? And this is from Queens, New York. So, two things. First of all, the problem of buying and selling at all, in general, in halacha is a rabbinic prohibition, right? The Torah does not prohibit business on Shabbat at all. I mean, it's something that people sometimes are surprised about because the very really major thing on Shabbat is, don't go to work on Shabbat. Which people shouldn't do, of course. They shouldn't go to work on Shabbat. But much of the problem of work, if it includes buying and selling, and many of the things that revolve around work, are rabbinic prohibitions in nature rather than biblical prohibitions. That's not to say that there aren't biblical prohibitions when one goes to work. There very likely are. But buying and selling, what we call masau matan, mekachom imkar, is rabbinic in its prohibition. Therefore, because it was rabbinic, the hachamim were prohibitive and were allowed things in particular areas where they felt that it could or should be allowed. So an example of this, right? Not with buying and selling. An example with measuring, right? It's prohibited to measure on Shabbat. You're not allowed to weigh things on Shabbat, right? But the hachamim allow weights and measures that are for halachic purposes or mitzvah purposes, more accurately, not halachic purposes, but mitzvah purposes. So, Hacham Ovadiah posek that if you want to weigh your matzah on Lil Pesach to kind of have an idea of how much matzah you have, as long as it's not electric or whatever, just a regular clip scale or something like that, you're allowed to do so, right? Even though normally you're not allowed to weigh things. And this is the same idea. So the poskim who allow it because it's a buying and selling that is mitzvah oriented. And because it's mitzvah oriented, there's no prohibition. The Hachamim didn't include that in the prohibition. That's the basic idea behind it. Following question comes from New York. Are horoscopes today considered avodah zarah? Well, it all depends on what it is that you're doing with horoscopes. I mean, if you're just reading horoscopes for entertainment purposes, not really. I mean, there's nothing particularly problematic with that. The bigger problem is, are you living by the horoscope? Are you going to get horoscope readings? Are you going to get horoscope readings and doing things based on those readings, and so on and so forth? If you're doing any of that, it's not avodah zarah proper, but it is in the family of avodah zarah, because you are believing in things that are outside the nature of your relationship in Brit with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rambam brings the rules for this, or the laws for this, in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, at the end of Hilchot Avodah Zarah, in Perek Yod Aleph, And he lists a whole bunch of things that we're not allowed to do. And one of the things that we're not allowed to do is to look into the future, to ask people to tell us the future, do fortune telling, horoscopes, and so on and so forth. So all of that is very, very poor behavior. And it's not to be done if that's the way that you're using it. Again, if you're reading it for entertainment purposes, it's not, I mean, it's not prohibited. It's not necessarily advisable, but it's not prohibited. But to do anything significant in terms of that is wrong. I will read you how Harambam closes that entire set of halachot in Perek Yod Aleph. He says, "Devarim elu kulan divrei sheker v'chazavim." All of these things that people do in order to be able to tell the future, in order to be able to know the unknown, in order to be able to kind of, have an idea of where life is going and what's going to happen to them, they're all lies. They're all lies. And they are שהטעו בהם עובדי הכוכבים הקדמונים לגויי הארצות כדי שינהגו אחריהם. These are the very tactics that practitioners of Avodah Zarah used in order to be able to lure people into their practice. So that's why it's within the family of Avodah Zarah, because it pulls people away from the idea of Tamim Tiyeh Adonai Lecha. Be faithful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Be whole and complete with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Stop trying to cheat your way through life by figuring out, cutting corners and finding shortcuts in order to be able to get through, rather than what you're supposed to do, which is maintain a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and have faith in Him. Ve'en ra'ui liYisrael. It is unfitting for Yisrael shehem hachamim mechukamim, that they are wise people, the descendants of wise people and intelligent people, limashech b'habadim elu, to be drawn after these absolute empty ideas, this nonsense, basically. Don't even consider the fact that there's any benefit to any of this stuff. Because we don't have superstitions in Israel. And it says explicitly, these nations that you are yoresh, that you're coming in and taking over from them, essentially, right? You're conquering them. That's their whole problem. They are drunk on these ideas of fortune telling and future telling and all kinds of weird heebie-jeebie stuff that they like to do. And anybody who believes in these things and thinks in his heart that they're true, it's just that the Torah prohibited them for us, but they actually have something to them. They're idiots, basically, is what Rambam says. They just don't have intelligence. They haven't fully formed their ideas or their intelligence. But people who are genuinely wise and that are whole in their knowledge, know clearly that all these things that Torah prohibited are not wise things at all. They're absolute nonsense. That people without any real understanding or real intelligence followed. Venatashu, and this is the most important line. Natashu kol darkei ha'emet biglalan. All of the paths of truth were destroyed because of this nonsense. Because people follow the nonsense and don't rigorously follow truth. And there's these things are absolute nonsense. So if you want to waste your time with nonsense, right? I mean, reading nonsense, well, I mean, it's a very poor way to spend your time, but it's not prohibited unless you're actually doing something based on these things, right? That's already prohibited. It's not Avodah Zarah proper, but it is absolutely within the family of Avodah Zarah. Next question. At what point would you say I can begin making my own decisions in regards to halacha without having to consult a rabbi? This is also from New York. I don't know who you are, so I don't know who I is. But in general, the basic answer is you need to know the halacha. I mean, you need to know how to deal with halacha. You have to know the mechanisms of halacha and be able to know how to be posek halacha. And that takes a tremendous amount of study and scholarship. So I have absolutely no idea how much time you've been studying, what you've studied, who you've learned from, so on and so forth. I mean, there's so many variables to this that I can't answer. All I can say is that in general, a person really needs to know the ins and outs of halacha in order to be able to establish law based on halacha, right? The reason why we ask rabbis is because we are lacking scholarship. and we are lacking the understanding of not just specific bits of information, but also how to manage and deal with that information, right? To be a posek, it's not just about knowing a lot of things. It's about knowing what to do with knowing a lot of things. And if the posek does not know how to do that, and one of the ways to do that is to be able to have shimush with acham. You need to spend time with a posek in order to be able to know how to do that, right? So that's very important. It's not just about knowing a lot of information. It's not like when I know X amount, I'll be able to be posek. Some hachamim could be, absolutely proficient and experts in all of their knowledge and still not really know how to be posek. That's absolutely possible, right? And there are people who are geonim. I mean, they know Talmud backwards and forwards. Cannot be posek halacha. They just don't know how to apply it, right? So there's one thing to be able to know the information. There's another thing to know how to apply the information, ultimately how to adjudicate the information in given circumstances. So, you need somebody who is already a Moreh Hora'ah to be able to recognize in you that you are ready to be Moreh Hora'ah and that you have the ability to do so, which is why, the Rabbanut in its truest sense, not today, and where it's become nothing more than a profession and, political, nonsense. The true Rabbanut is when somebody says to you that is already in that position, Yore Yore, you now can be Moreh, which means you can now establish what law is in given circumstances that are presented to you. And even then, right, appropriately, when people are given what we call quote unquote semicha, which is really just the ability, somebody in authority saying to you, and what do I mean by authority? Somebody who is recognized already as having the ability to be moreh ora'ah, saying to you that you can also be moreh ora'ah. But even in those areas, being moreh ora'ah is also often relegated to particular areas of halacha, not in all areas of halacha, right? So maybe you have the ability to, I mean, nobody asks this of rabbis anymore today, or nobody really pays attention to any of it anyway, because either people don't care about halacha or they don't, it's not about halacha anymore, even though their semicha pretty much always is about that, or they are getting semicha when they shouldn't have it. But, ultimately, when a person gets what we're calling the vernacular semicha, for all intents and purposes, they're getting a piece of paper that actually says the words yore yore on it, right? And what does that mean? It means that in these areas of law that you have studied and shown the ability to be able to establish decisions based on what it is that you've studied, you now can rule on these areas of halacha. That's really what it is, right? Um, so that requires kind of some levels of assessment and, certainly a tremendous amount of scholarship and so on and so forth. But I'm not going to give a kind of a system of what it is you need to know in order to be able to be posek. That's something that, needs to have a conversation. You need to be able to, the Hacham should know who you are and so on and so forth and what you're able to do and not able to do. So I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a kind of a direct answer to that question. It's a very important question, really, but that's something that is not a textbook answer. Okay. Is mixed dancing actually forbidden? Is it a minhag? Is it allowed to attend a mixed party and not dance? This is from Queens. That's a good question. I don't know why you're asking about dancing per se. I mean, there are much more minor things that are prohibited, right, than that. It's a very big problem. It's a very big problem. I mean, I'll read you what the halacha is, how Rambam posek. Maran Shulchan Aruch posek the same thing. He writes in Perek Kaf Aleph Hilchot Isurei Bi'ah the following. He says, yeah. Asur le'adam likrot biyadav u'braglav. Right? It's prohibited for a person to motion either with his hand or his legs, or his arms or his legs, or lirmoz be'enav, or even to hint with his eyes. La'ahat min ha'arayot, to any woman that is an arva to him. Right? What does that mean? No flirtation whatsoever. Right? No indications whatsoever of any kind of overtures that are, provocative in nature, even in the slightest degree, to a woman who is an arva to him. V'chen l'sahek and certainly to laugh with her, or lehakel rosh, or to act frivolously, right, with her, right, not to treat the situation seriously, being that this is a dangerous situation. Afilu lehariach besamim she'aleha, you're not allowed to even intentionally smell her perfume for the intention of getting satisfaction from that in any sexual way. Or lehabit beyofia, you're not even allowed to look at her beauty with the intent to enjoy her beauty. Umakin amitkavin devar ze makad mardud. In the good old days, we would whip somebody for doing this if we were able to see that they did and found that they were. Okay. Now, dancing isn't the problem. It's all of this other stuff which comes before, right? So there's no question about the fact that dancing is absolutely a problem, but so is all of this other stuff, right? You can't kiss a woman hello. It's something that I think is profoundly intriguing in Western society. Not only Western society, but certainly in Western society, where people just feel that a woman can be kissed. I don't mean kissed, on the mouth, kissed on the cheek. Men will shake hands and then kiss a woman as a greeting. Why is that permitted? When did that become okay? Yeah, as a matter of fact, I will never forget this. Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and she was, I think it was it John Boehner who was before her? I think he was the speaker before her, and he was handing over the gavel to her. And he shook everyone's hand and then went over to kiss Nancy Pelosi. And she was even interested. She was going to shake his hand. He kissed Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, right? Gave her. So these things are absolutely unacceptable and prohibited. That's the halakha, right? The fact that Western society no longer recognizes this, doesn't recognize this as a thing at all anymore today is, it's unfortunate, but that's the reality. Forget about these things. The entirety of Western civilization is completely and utterly entrenched in sex, right? There's nothing that you can do to get away from it. So as far as the halakha is concerned, yes, it's prohibited. There's no question about that. There's a difference, which I'm not going to get into, between a woman who's an arva and a woman who's not an arva to you. But even with regards to that, there is prohibitions about behaving this way in general with women, because you don't know whether she's an arva or not, to be honest, right? In most cases, right? And even if you do know that she's not an arva, Harambam writes, right? You just don't expose yourself to these kinds of things because you are, the reality is that it gets you into trouble. So there's all kinds of people that get upset with this and argue with this and so on and so forth. I am not suggesting that men and women should not interact, right? People need to be able to know how to be in society. There's no prohibition just to look at a woman. The looking that's problematic is that Harambam wrote over there is the looking for the sake of gratification sexually, right? For those purposes, that's what's prohibited. And okay, so that's what's prohibited. It's not asur to look a woman in the eye when you talk to her and about what's going on in the world, or whatever the case may be. That's not prohibited. So the people that block women's pictures out of every possible photo, that's a bit absurd, right? And that's not something that was done by even the greatest of Hachamim in the beginning of the 20th century. Nobody did that. It's only modern people who crazily do things like that. But as far as dancing is concerned, all these other things are also problematic and prohibited. So it's something that needs to be avoided. I'm not saying you shouldn't go to the wedding, or I'm saying a wedding because that's where it usually happens, right? But I'm not saying that you shouldn't go to these parties, but it's best to leave the room when that is going on, right? It's not good to be present in those places. Certainly not to sit and watch it, right? If it's hard for you to leave it, then you mind your own business and look at other things. But it's the equivalent of kind of being involved and looking at somebody doing something that's asur, and here specifically the looking is involved in the isur. that's best really not to participate in. So when I find myself in those situations, I tend to leave the room when that's going on. Oftentimes I don't stay when that starts. I leave at the time that starts. But if for whatever reason I can't leave, I leave the room during that period of time. But it's not something that, and it's not because I'm uber machmir on anything or whatever the case may be. It's asur, right? So that's that. Next, should every Jew in this day and age have concrete plans to move to Israel with a concrete amount of time? Is it legitimate to intend to build one's life and family in diaspora, taking into account the advantages and hardships, and have no concrete intent of ever making Aliyah? From Strasbourg, France. That's a good question. I have a few questions of Aliyah here, so I'm going to kind of lump them all into the space. So there's a few things that are being asked here. First, should in this day and age, I don't know why it's in this day and age, more so in this day and age than any other day and age, or at least any day and age in the last 2,000 years. I'll start this way. I think that every single Jew, right, who wants to live faithfully as a Jew, must begin by asking themselves the question of why am I not there? That is the place that you begin, right? I absolutely think that every Jew has to ask that question, right? And the reason why you ask that is because you can be there ostensibly, potentially, right? For 2,000 years, it wasn't realistic to be able to live there, right? You could, and there were definitely, people who did move to Eretz Israel just to be in Eretz Israel, right? There's no question about it. Ramban Nachmani was very staunch about this. He counts this as one of the mitzvot of the Torah. Rambam doesn't count it, but the Ramban Nachmani disagrees and counts it, and he put his money where his mouth was, and he moved to Eretz Israel, right? The Vilna Gaon did the same, right? Harambam spent some time in Eretz Israel, but he didn't end up living there. Yeah, but so that means that there are reasons why people are allowed to live outside of Eretz Israel, which is why I'm saying the first question that a modern Jew in this day and age, when we have Medinat Israel and we have the ability to live there, not only do you have the ability to live there, you are welcomed by the Medina and you're given support and help by the Medina. The first question that a Jewish person needs to ask themselves is, why am I not there? And you need to think about what the answers to that question are. And then after you find your answers to that question, appropriately, the responsible thing to do, again, if a person wants to live according to halacha and to be a faithful Jew, needs to vet the answers and question the legitimacy of those answers as far as halacha is concerned, right? So there is halacha, the person is not supposed to leave Eretz Israel once they're there, right? Unless there's certain circumstances that require them to leave. That's number one. Number two, I will say, look, there are times in history in where it was not conducive, and this may be one of those times, depending on who you are, right? So it's not a blanket thing. It's not that every Jew must be there and every Jew who is not there is transgressing, right? It's not the case. Ultimately, it has to do with who you are, what you're doing, and why are you not there. If it's just a matter of convenience, that's problematic, right? But if there's something that you're doing outside of Israel, and it happens to be Parnasa oriented or something of that nature. And Parnasa is a tricky one, right? Because we say, well, I have no Parnasa there. Well, I mean, how much have you explored your opportunities for Parnasa there, right? Realistically. And when you say Parnasa, is that you're not going to be making the same several $1,000,000 that you're making now there? Is that valid or not valid? And so on and so forth, right? Again, it's not a textbook question that I can just simply put on, this is the formula, and if you meet this formula, move to Israel. Yeah, I don't think that's not how it works. But if I were to advise and people that genuinely care about this thing, care about even the question, and I think that from your question you care about it, um, it's not a concrete thing, like you say. No, nothing's concrete, right? You have to be able to consider your life in terms of where it is that it's going and where you see it and what you ultimately want. The end of your question and have no concrete intent of ever making aliyah, that is problematic. Right? There should never be a situation where a Jewish person just has no interest or thought about making aliyah, where it doesn't enter the realm of their idea. Right? Remember that HaKadosh Baruch Hu never promised Avraham Avinu a Torah. He didn't promise Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov a Torah. Actually, was never spoken about. What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu promise them? Land, land, and land. And what are the criteria for hiring Moshe to take Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim? Moshe, I need you to take the people out of Mitzrayim and bring them into the land. That's the whole thing. Eretz Israel, the whole of Torah. It's like the Ramban Nachmani says, right? He says the whole of Torah, all of the mitzvot of Torah are mitzvot tetuliyot ba'aretz. They're mitzvot that apply to the land. That's why, I mean, these questions about what do I do with Sefirat HaOmer in Alaska or whatever the case may be. I mean, yeah, okay, you have to answer the question, but it's not meant to be done there. The Torah is meant to be kept in Eretz Israel. Yeah. So when you're, in frigid temperatures, trying to manage your sukkah, well, yeah, I mean, welcome to Galut. But it's not meant to be done outside of Israel. So again, to sum up, the question that every Jew must ask is, why am I not there? And the answers have to be answered as honestly as possible, which is very, very hard for people to do. And therefore, it's very good to have somebody objective sitting with you when you do this, if you genuinely care about answering the question. And then you have to scrutinize the answers and question their legitimacy. And based on that, you assess whether you're transgressing or not transgressing, or whether you're doing what's right or wrong. And then you may come to the conclusion that, well, I should be there, but I'm not ready to do that personally. Okay, well, at least you're honest and but you've dealt with it. Right? It's better to deal with it in that way than to just completely consider, yeah, it's just not a thing for me. That's not acceptable, in my opinion, for a Jewish person. Yeah. One more thing that I'll say about that is it helps to succeed in Eretz Israel if you believe on some level that there's really no other place for you to live. Right? And that's part of a person's journey, right? And an understanding why it is that might be the case, right? Okay, I'll leave that. Hope that's helpful. What is the ultimate goal of Jewish individual life? Is it to come to a closer understanding and connection to God, to raise children, to follow in the way of our religion, to learn as much as possible? This is also from New York. Well, Harambam answers that question explicitly. So I'll read you Harambam's answer to that question. It's quite unequivocal. And he says as follows. This is in Hilchot De'ot, Perek Gimel, Halacha Bet. Tzarich Adam, the human must Yechaven libo, must aim his heart v'chol ma'asav kulam, and all of his deeds, leda et Hashem Baruch Hu bilvad, to know God, and that's it. V'yeshipto v'kumo v'diburo, and everything that he does, his sitting, his standing, his speaking, meaning all of his stuff, everything that he does, hakol le'umat ze hadavar, all opposite this thing, right? All has to be aiming at that thing. So that's your answer, right? That's it. It's to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Everything that you do in your life ultimately is meant to be geared towards that. It is either doing that or supporting doing that. That's it. So the whole of the religion is only to be able to support you to do that. If it's doing something else, if the religion is doing something else, well, then you're practicing some other religion. It may look like Judaism, may sound like, smell like Judaism, feel like it's not Judaism, right? If it's doing something other than that. And building a family, well, building a family is not an obligation, right? I mean, it's one of the mitzvot of the Torah. There's Peru Rubu, that's there, sure, but there's a reason for that. And that is also the Da'at Hashem Baruch Hu, right? And Harambam deals with that and the elaboration here of how it's meant to be, how this manifests in our lives practically, because he asks after this, Ketzad, how do I mean what I just said? He goes through a whole thing, which I don't have time to go through over here, but I encourage you, to look at it and read it. And I've taught this many times. I have a whole series on Hilchot Derot that I taught the LSJS. That one day my shiurim will be accessible again for people. I'm sorry that that's down, but I'm actually talking to some people about doing that. Some wonderful talmidim I think in Miami that are considering doing that. So we'll see if that comes about. But I'm sorry for that. The shiurim being non-accessible for so long. But we're working to remedy that. Okay, so I hope that answers that. What is the definition, responsibility, and goal of a family? On a personal level, all of us building a family, and on a national level, building the national family of Israel is from New Jersey. That's a good question, right? It's a good question. And the Torah talks to us about that, right? So the first thing is that ultimately there are different levels, right, of family. That there's no question about the fact that Torah puts high emphasis on family and on loyalty to family, right? On loyalty to family, right? And it's interesting how far the Torah goes with this. Yeah. So on the outskirts of this, right, to show the loyalty of Torah, the Torah says, for example, Lo tetarev adumi. You are not to treat a person from Edom, right, who comes from the nation of Edom, poorly, right? Do not scorn them, do not treat them poorly, do not disregard them. Ki achichahu, because they're your brothers. How are they your brothers? Twin brothers, Esav and Yaakov. So even though Esav left the family, left the breed, wanted to kill Yaakov, right, at certain intervals, and so on and so forth, still the Torah says, do not treat them abominably, right? Do not treat them in a way that is repulsive or pushes them away, right? Treat them with respect, treat them with care on a certain level. Why? Excuse me. Ki achichahu, because he's your brother. That's fascinating, right? So even after all of that, the Torah still requires what we call hakarat tov, right? That you recognize that they're still connected to you, right? That you shared a womb with them, essentially, right? Way back when. You shared the same parents. You grew up in the same house. Yeah. And so when they're not trying to kill you, which is on rare occasions, right? Nonetheless, when they're just kind of an average neutral individual, not, it's in the negative, right? Don't treat them badly, is essentially what the Torah says. It doesn't say bring them close, love them, hug them. It doesn't say that. It says don't treat them badly, right? That's the far outskirts of family. As far as the family, the national family of Israel, Haftalah racha kamocha is not humanity. Haftalah racha kamocha is your brethren that are part of your am, right? Part of your nation. That's the halachic definition of the pasuk, and that's all of Klal Yisrael. Kol echad ve'echad mi Yisrael, as Harambam writes, right in Hilchot. Assuming that they are within Klal Yisrael, meaning that they accept the basic tenets of Klal Yisrael. And the idea of Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lazeh, or Ze Bazeh, one way, there's different nushawat, right? That we all are responsible for each other. So that's in the broad national family, and yes, that is definitely how people are meant to behave. Love doesn't equal like. You don't have to like the family. You have to love them. And love them doesn't mean something that you feel. It's not an emotion, right? Love them is how it is that you treat them. Are you looking out for their good? Do you speak in their praise the way that you would want yourself? You would speak about yourself, or you would want yourself to be spoken about. Do you treat their belongings and their money the way that you would want your belongings and your money to be treated? That's what the national family is, and to have the responsibility of that. In terms of personal family, the Torah basically looks at the nuclear family as central, and it is the children, the wife that you have, and the children that you have, not the family of origin. Right? The family of origin is secondary, tertiary. Right? Your primary family. As a matter of fact, the Torah says, leave them. Right? You should leave your mother and father and cling to your wife. Right? That's your family. So when a person gets married, your spouse is your family. Everyone else is number 10. They are number 1 through 10. And that's how the Torah expects us to relate to it. And your own children, right? Your children are your responsibility until it's time for them to leave you, which they, eventually do, assuming all goes okay, right? And that's what they're meant to do. And that is the idea of Lech Lecha, right? Where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avram Avinu, leave your father's house, the place you were born, everything that's familiar to you, and go out and become an individual, right? And then you build your own nucleus and your own family. So there is that. Nonetheless, and you kind of find that in the laws of inheritance, but nonetheless, there's also some very interesting things with regards to family, where halachically, siblings are, in terms of inheritance and those issues, are only from the father, right? So siblings that a person might have only from their mother are not siblings in the eyes of the law in terms of monetary issues, right? Siblings, brother, in ahva. Ahva is only with the av, not with the em. So there's all these very interesting kinds of things of family dynamics. But ultimately, your family is the person that you marry and the children that you have, and that is it, right? That's your family. Ultimately, they will then grow up and leave, right? And they will do their own things. So that doesn't mean that there's a severing, but there is a distancing. And the responsibilities of going backwards, right, are only when there are no children or children are not at play and so on and so forth, right? Then you go back into brothers of the parents, brothers of the grandparents, so on and so forth. There's also responsibility that people have to their grandchildren, right, in terms of teaching them, supporting them, giving them of their wisdom and their old age, and so on and so forth. So there's all different aspects of it, but on general level, family is central to Torah and of high value. Next question. What is required for a kosher and halachic conversion to Judaism? And why is there a different standard in different places and communities? Good question. So it all depends, right? Who's converting? It all depends who's converting. So in the core, right, on the books, what's required for a bona fide, proper conversion to Judaism it starts with the person converting. So if the person, it needs to be seen that the person is converting for no ulterior motives, right? Not to marry, not because they think that there's something that's going to be beneficial for them personally, in terms of converting and so on and so forth. That's not conversion as far as the Torah is concerned, right? And so there has to be a recognition of the fact that this person is converting because they want to be part of the family of Israel, right? Based on the, kind of on the question that we just had. That's what they need to want. And that's why when we ask them questions, according to halakha, we don't ask them, do you know about God or do you want to become close to God? We don't ask them a question. What we ask them is, why do you want to become part of Am Yisrael? That's what we ask them. Don't you know that Am Yisrael has this experience in the world of oppression and so on and so forth? That is what we ask them. We ask them, why do you want to come into the people and to be part of the family? That's what they need. And what do they need to do? Once they accept that, then they need to accept upon themselves mitzvot. They need to go to the mikveh, and in the old days, they had to bring a korban right in front of a beit din. That's what's required. The problem is that today, a high number of people convert for marriage, which is less than, what should I say? It's less than prime in terms of kind of the motivating factors. And when a person is converting for marriage, there is a deep concern that they will do so, and that they're not really holding seriously the desire to become part of Am Yisrael in the most genuine sense. And then the reason for the different terms, or what you say, the different standards in different communities is based on the Beit Din. The Beit Din has the authority to determine what the standards are, right, and how they are going to accept, right, what they're going to require of you. So depending on which Beit Din you go to will be the standards that you experience. And that is why certain Batei Din do or do not recognize the conversions of other Batei Din, right? Because it could be that my Beit Din, right? And there are certain conversions that my Beit Din does not recognize because we don't think the standards were appropriate, right? In terms of being able to perform the conversion. This incidentally, although it's controversial, is one of the reasons why the Herem of the Syrian community has some sound basis halachically, right? Because otherwise you could say, how could it be that the Syrian community? I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with it. I'm just simply talking about the technical terms of it, right? How could you say, how could the Syrian community say we're not accepting a convert when the Torah says to you, "V'ahavtem et hager," right? You have to love the ger. How could you not love the ger? How could not only not love the ger, reject the ger, right? How could you do that? Well, the answer is we don't recognize the conversions of the Beit Din that they converted with. They are not obligated to recognize the conversion of Beit Din that converted them. And that's essentially the decision of the community that they don't recognize them, right? Okay, so people could argue with this, right, back and forth, luckily, but that's the idea, that's the concept, right? So once that question is the case, once there's a question of why are you converting, and if it's anything other than I wish to become part of the nation of Israel. I'm not even worthy to become part of the nation of Israel, but I can only see myself in that context. And I wish to be able to be part of everything that they're a part of. If it's anything other than that, that may or may not be a conversion that the Beit Din will accept. And we have accepted those things. Harambam wrote about that for accepting that because we don't want them to end up marrying goyim or whatever the case may be. So there's terms and reasons why we might accept it, but they're problematic. And the Beit Din may be quite strict in terms of the terms that they require in order for a person to convert. I hope that answers that question. I know that it's 9:34, but you can log off, but I only have a few more questions. So I'm gonna try and get through these, right? So we're gonna go for 90 minutes instead of an hour. And Rav Ohad, I don't mean to take any more time from you, but if you need to log off and give me the thing to close it up, we can close it up. But I'd rather just finish if it's possible. What's a halachic answer to using? Oh, I'm not doing that one. Sorry, not gonna answer that. All right, Rambam. There's only 2 or 3 questions I'm not answering. This one I can't answer because I don't understand. The words are not coming out right. But I'm going to try and answer this anyway. Somebody's asking about something that Harambam wrote in Yesodei Torah, and then it's like all gibberish. I don't know what it is, but it says, what does this mean in terms of how we view God's connection to Him, and also the classic song, God is here, God is there, God is truly everywhere, up, down, left, right, all around. I know that song. And are we a piece of Him? So first of all, that song is a Chabad song, and it's not true, right? We don't say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everywhere, right? In that sense, yeah. It's not that He's locked out of any place. Has v'shalom, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can be anywhere that He wishes to be, but it's not that we're all swimming in God stuff, right? That's not. I mean, clearly, there are different concentrations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence, and when we talk about presence, we're talking about mutual relationship, right? Shekhinah, the term that we use for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence, is not another word for God. It is a specific manifestation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's relationship with us, right? So it's not just God being somewhere. It's a question of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's interaction with us. That's what Shekhinah is. So, for example, the Hachamim say, Me'olam no zaza Shekhinah mikota ma'aravi. The Shekhinah never left the western wall, right, of the Beit HaMikdash, of the supporting wall of the Mikdash. What does that mean? It means that there was always some connection between HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Eretz Yisrael, and Am Yisrael that manifested in that space, right? That manifested in that place. Well, if that's the case, right, clearly HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence there is different than HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence in Las Vegas. It's just nobody would equate that, right? That's nobody, in their right mind would equate those two things, right? It isn't the same to be standing in Yerushalayim as it is to be standing in Idaho. It's just not the same. Yeah, and one must recognize that it's not the same. And what's not the same about it? Essentially, the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, that's not to say that a person cannot connect with HaKadosh Hu anywhere in the world. Yes, a person can connect with HaKadosh Hu anywhere in the world, but there are also places where it's not appropriate to connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Isn't that true? Right? You don't connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the toilet or in a garbage dump. You don't do that, right? And one of the reasons for that is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not assert His presence in the world. As a matter of fact, the default is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is removed, not connected. And in order for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be engaged, this is a world in which, I've said many times, this is not a world in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu asserts His presence. It's a world in which we create the circumstances for His presence. Yeah? And so that is on us. Otherwise, the default is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't here. Why would He be? Right? And what do I mean by that? I don't mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not powering the universe. Of course, He's powering. Ata mehayeh kulam, we say, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives existence to all of it. Or as Harambam writes in Yesodei Torah, Hu mamtzi kol nimtza, right? He currently, in the hoveh, in the present, sustains all that exists, right? With existence, yeah? So that's happening, but that's like battery power, right? That's the energy that runs and allows for things to be. That's very different than energy of connection, relationship, engagement, right? That's very different. And that is at the default not something that we expect to be, right? Something that we must work towards, which makes all the sense in the world, of course, right? It makes all the sense in the world, right? But so I hope that that helps that on some level. And this last question, as you said, what was it? Are we a piece of him? No, we're not a piece of him. We're not a piece of him. He's not. He doesn't get made into pieces. Yeah. But to be able to go through that in more depth requires really proper learning and background and prerequisite classes and so on and so forth in order to be able to deal with that. That was a question from Haifa. So thank you for that question. What are the halachic issues of praying by graves of rabbis? Why do you think it is so widespread? There are no major halachic issues by praying at graves of rabbis. The question is, why are you praying at graves of rabbis? All right, so you have to be very honest about this. If you're praying at graves of rabbis because you're praying to the rabbis, well, that's not okay, right? That's what we call avodah zarah. Yeah, very clearly, there's a very big problem with that, and that one may not do. That is a halachic problem. If you're not doing that and you're saying no, which is what everybody says, I'm not praying to the rabbi. The next level down is I'm asking the rabbi to pray for me, or I'm asking the rabbi to pray on my behalf. Well, that is not avodah zarah in my understanding of it, but it is absolutely inappropriate, right? Because first of all, who said that you have access to the rabbi? Who said the rabbi is listening to you? And who said that the rabbi has the ability to pray on your behalf? Right? There's no such basis for this whatsoever in Torah. There's nowhere in the Talmud where we see this going on. So in classical Judaism, in normative Judaism, this is just not a thing, right? The final thing that people say, and this is the least offensive, quote unquote, is that I pray at the rabbi's grave so that the zechut of the rabbi, right, the merit of the rabbi, whatever that might be, should kind of, be an extra oomph or push to my prayer, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? That also, I mean, look, it's not necessarily prohibited, but it's also not particularly meaningful or necessarily positive to do. We don't see that concept, right? And all of this does smell of avodah zarah, right? Even though it's not necessarily avodah zarah proper, unless you're actually praying to the rabbi, it smells of avodah zarah. Why? Because you are circumventing again your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And why do people do that? Why do I think it's so widespread? It's widespread in the same way superstitions are widespread, in the same way segulot are widespread, in the same way, all of these other things, these, fortune telling and all the stuff we had before are widespread. Why is it widespread? Because people cannot manage faithful relationships. That's why. And they can barely manage faithful relationships in their own lives, much less with God. And when it says Tamim tiem Adonai Elohecha, it means you be whole with God. All of you, not part of you. Don't cheat on God by trying to circumvent things in some other way. You pray to God. You talk to God. You speak to Him. He can hear you if you genuinely focus your heart and mind on talking to Him. And there's no reason why He wouldn't listen. Before they're even done calling me, I'll answer them, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But they have to call me, right? Karov Adonai lechol kore'av. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is close to everyone who calls him. Who's calling him truly. And anybody who's involved in any of this stuff is not calling him truly. Because they are not connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and recognizing HaKadosh Baruch Hu will listen to me in my space, in my place, from my heart, and he's the one that I need to seek. Nobody else. No other rabbi, no other tzaddik, no other anyone. He is the one. He is the highest. He is the only one that I must connect to. And this concept of thinking about needing some kind of an intermediary of any nature in order to be able to engage with HaKadosh Hu, even a boost, so to speak, in order to be able to engage with HaKadosh Hu, Harambam writes at the opening of Hilchot Avodah Zarah that was the whole reason why people started Avodah Zarah in the first place, because they stopped thinking they could connect with God directly, and then they brought in intermediaries, and then those became the gods. So it's a very dangerous thing. It's a very slippery slope, and it should be avoided. Thankfully, I don't have any of these things. I'm a Kohen, so I never had to be challenged or struggle with these kinds of things. But nonetheless, just not worth it. I'll tell you though, I'm not really missing anything. I'm very, I'm working on my own connection. What are the three top concerns you have for the future of Jewish thought and practice, and what are the top three hopes you have for Jewish thought and practice? This is from London. I have a lot of concerns for the future of Jewish thought and practice. Um, and I'm not going to be confined to answering three. I will simply say one for now. The one that I have is in my mind the root of all problems. And the root of all problems is that our education system is horrible. It's better in some places, worse in others, but across the board, horrible. We aren't teaching people. We aren't teaching young members of Am Yisrael what they need to be able to be good, strong members of Am Yisrael. We are not educating our children. My hope is that we should be able to educate our children, right? But in order to be able to do that, I was a headmaster of a school, and I know how hard it is to educate our children. It isn't an easy thing, right? The idea of it takes a village to raise a child is not a joke. Yeah. So in order to be able to have a school that runs well, or a system of education that runs well, people make a tremendous mistake of thinking that if only we had the curriculum. The curriculum is never the problem. It's the implementation of the curriculum that's the problem. And the implementation of the curriculum is profoundly challenging because you need teachers that understand it, that are invested in it, and both, right? Both of those things are hugely difficult, right? How do you get a teacher to understand it properly and to be invested in it personally, that they're going to teach it from that place? If there's anything less than that, it simply will not work. Then you can say, okay, well, what is the curriculum? Well, outlining the curriculum is relatively easy. Understand? You got to somebody who knows this stuff, write it out. But you can't do that. You need to write it with the teachers. You need to be able to set up a system that is conducive to its implementation, and you need to be able to have buy-in from many stakeholders, from parents, from educators, from the kids, and so on and so forth. Right? It's a very big challenge to solve, which is why it's so daunting. But I'm not exaggerating when I say that our educational system is horrendous. Again, let's not say that there aren't pockets of light, but they are minor pockets of light. The overall educational system amongst the Jewish people across the board in Israel and outside of Israel is absolutely horrible. And that's the main problem. And I believe that if that were fixed, it would fix everything. It would take time, but it would be, or it may not fix everything, it would be a huge change, a huge change. What are the it's interesting this comes afterwards. It's also from London? No, it's from New Jersey, but nonetheless compliments, right? What are the sources for Tanakh study being so important and primary for Jewish learning? Is it not the focus of most yeshivot? It is not the focus of most yeshivot. Why is that? So it's true. It should be. What is the source? The source is halakha. I mean, it's very clear in the halakha in Hilchot Talmud Torah that every person has an obligation to teach their children the entirety of Tanakh. Torah bichtav kullah. Just to start with, right? It's not that they shouldn't learn anything else. They have to learn all of Torah, right? Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh. They have to learn it all. That's the halacha. But we start with Torah shebichtav. And Torah shebichtav is the entirety of Torah shebichtav. It's Harambam Posek and Hilchot Talmud Torah and Perek Aleph. Very, very clearly. And what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to start teaching children Pesukim. But we don't do that because we think we're smarter than that. And we do all kinds of other things and teach them everything but Torah, right? Why is it that the yeshivot don't do this? There's many reasons why the yeshivot don't do this, right? One is because it's hard to get into, but it depends what you mean by the yeshivot. Do you mean the higher age yeshivot, the Jewish day schools? What is it that you mean? If you're talking about the Jewish day schools, in all honesty, and I don't mean this in a prejudice kind of way, the Ashkenazim ruined that, right? Because the idea started amongst the Ashkenazim with the Tosafot and other Rishonim that held that we no longer have to teach Mikra to children, Qua Mikra, that we can simply teach them Talmud because the Mikra is in it, right? Talmud Bavli is Kol Balul, right? Everything is mixed into it, which many people took and actually ran with. The Sfaradim really never did, right? We always taught our children Tanakh and Mikra, but when we started to meet up with them, we didn't open our own schools. We didn't continue that way of teaching, and we put our children into schools that were run, in that way, in the Ashkenazi way. And then it just took over the entire Jewish world, and so we stopped doing that. And that has destroyed Jewish education to a great degree. So you have children that are going through 12 and 13 years of education, if they're in Jewish day schools, their whole childhood, coming out knowing almost nothing about Torah. They may know some things here and there about Judaism in general, but they don't really come out knowing 12 years worth of Torah, which is what they should be coming out knowing. And I've said before many times, I'll say it here because it's in the context of the question. I've met before, and I'm continuing to meet with administrators of school districts in Israel, right? Not just schools, school districts in Israel, Chiloni school systems. And I say to them, you're thieves because you're not teaching the kids Tanakh. It's not a religious thing. It's an identity thing, right? Every single Jewish child should learn Tanakh. Why? Because it belongs to them. That's why. And because if you don't give it to them, you're stealing from them something that belongs to them. And you are robbing them and castrating them of their own identity and heritage, which is the very source of their entire strength as a people. Every single Jewish child should learn Hebrew. It's a disaster that is not of the highest priority. So those are just two things, right? Why don't we just try those two things just to start with? Every Jewish child learning Tanakh, every Jewish child learning Hebrew. Yeah. But of course, no, that will not happen. So my hope is that. Why is gelatin not davara ma'amid, but rennet is? There's only one more question after this, and then we'll close. The answer to that is very simple. Rennet is considered, if it is genuine old school rennet, right? It's considered basar, right? It's considered part of the animal that is prohibited. And if the animal is not a kosher animal, it is asur in and of itself. Davara ma'amid, for those who don't know, davara ma'amid is something that causes coagulation or food to solidify. And so normally I would say, if a piece of isur, if a piece of prohibited food falls into or comes into contact with a permitted food, it can be batel, right? It can potentially be nullified in the mixture if there is enough of the mixture to cancel it out taste-wise, right? Depending on whether you can taste it or not. If it's the same taste, then it's not about taste, it's about amount. If it's about taste, it's about being able to detect the taste in the mixture. That does not apply for what we call davara ma'amid. Davara ma'amid solidifies or causes coagulation to the mixture, which means that it's always apparent that it's there. It can't be nullified because its effects are evident in the fact that it is having this coagulating or solidifying effect to the food. So davara ma'amid no batel, something that causes something that is unkosher or not allowed to be eaten by halakha, and is introduced into a mixture and causes the mixture to solidify, is always evident. So it cannot be batil. When is that the case? When the thing that goes into the mixture itself is asur. So rennet, in the old-fashioned sense of rennet, right? Not chemicals, but actually a piece of an animal's stomach, right? That had enzyme that was put in, that's asur, right? Why? Because it is not batil. And it's considered always to be there. It's halakha mefureshet. I'll read you the halakha. Halakha mefureshet. Hama'amid be'or kebat nevela. If a person uses the flesh of the stomach, right, the stomach lining, to to make the cheese, right, to solidify the cheese, of course, it's davar hama'amid, but it's nevela utrefa. But the thing you're using is nevela utrefa. Ube'emat emea oser bechol shehu. It's oser any amount that is put in there. You can make vats and vats of cheese from one tiny bit of it. Doesn't matter. It's all asur. Why? Because the amid. But why is that the case? Because the thing that you're using la'amid is asur in and of itself. The gelatin is not asur in and of itself. Why? Because it has lost its status as food. Because it's made from dried bone. And since the bone is completely dried down to nothing, right? There's no moisture to it anymore. It's not considered food, and therefore it is no longer asur. And this is brought in the Ramah in Shulchan Aruch Pezayin, but really it's brought in the Bet Yosef. Maran writes it in Bet Yosef. The Ramah just quotes it. Maran, for whatever reason, didn't quote it in the Shulchan Aruch, but it's halakha, and that is Or keva lefamim morhim oto. Sometimes they take the lining of the stomach, they salt it, umyebshim oto, and they dry it out, v'naasa ke'etz, and it becomes like a piece of wood. It no longer has any moisture to it. Umer'in oto halav, and then they put it into milk. They put milk into it. Denahar she'yabesh have ke'etz be'alma. And since it is completely dry and it's like a piece of wood, mutar, it's mutar to make cheese with that, even though it comes from a be'ema nevera. So that's what gelatin is, and therefore it can't be a davar ma'amid because it's not asur. I mean, it can be davar amid, but it's not an asur. It's not a davar amid shu asur, right? So there was no isur to begin with, and therefore it's okay. Finally, can I buy and eat bread from any store if the ingredients are kosher, and why? And the answer to that is it depends, right? So assuming yes that the ingredients are kosher, right? So we're going to make that as a premise. If you know for sure that the ingredients are kosher, can you buy bread from any store? So this is a question of pat akum, right? For bread that's made by a goy. And bread that's made by a goy, the beginning premise is that's prohibited. Why? Because we don't want you to break bread, because it causes connection and friendship and ultimately marriage and so on and so forth. The Hachamim prohibited this. It's an Isur D'Rabbanan. It's incidentally an Isur D'Rabbanan she'eno ikar min Torah. It's an Isur from the Hachamim that is not based on or connected to a prohibition from the Torah. They just established this Isur to keep distance from the Goyim so that we shouldn't marry them and connect them. But because they made this law, they also gave all the criteria for the law. And one of the criteria that they gave was that there are certain circumstances in which the problem with the bread is when it's being baked by an individual person, right? What we call pat balabayit, which follows the reasoning that if we're worried about marriage, you don't want to go over to someone's house and have them bake bread for you, right? You may marry their daughter, you may marry them, whatever the case may be, right? So what's the question? So the question is raised, what about pat palter? Pat palter is the baker, right? He's the town baker. He's not baking bread for you, he's baking bread for everybody, right? So it's not a personal thing per se. And so the Hachamim say that there is allowance for pat palter, for the baker's bread, under various conditions. Right? One condition is that there's no Jewish baker. Well, there's no Jewish baker. Well, then you buy from the non-Jewish baker. That's permitted. What if there is a Jewish baker in town, which generally Jewish communities have? Yeah, then what do you do? Well, in that case, there's a question as to are you able to get this kind of bread that you see the non-Jewish baker baking at the Jewish baker? Well, if you can't get that, right? If you cannot get baguettes at the Jewish baker, all he's making is a white loaf of bread or whatever the case may be, well, then you can buy the baguette at the non-Jewish baker because you can't get it at the Jewish baker. And again, this is all assuming that the ingredients are kosher, right? And the same is true if they both sell the exact same baguettes, but the Jewish baker charges more for his baguette than the non-Jewish baker. You can buy it from the non-Jewish baker. You don't have to pay more to do that, right? So under normal circumstances, yes, you can buy the bread from a store as long as the ingredients are kosher. If they are the equivalent of that bread is not sold by a Jewish baker, and even if it is the equivalent but is sold for more expensive, you can buy it in a non-Jewish from a non-Jewish baker. And my grandfather, once we were sitting with Chacham Ovadia Yosef, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, and outside of the Kotel, the Arabs sell these round breads with sesame, right? Simsum. And he asked Chacham Ovadia, can I buy that bread? Chacham Ovadia said, "Can." That was it. No other qualification for that, right? And that's all based on the things that I just said. Thank you all for these wonderful questions. I hope the answers were okay and satisfactory. Obviously, you know that when we've got only a short amount of time, there is a limit to how deep I can go into the answers to these questions, but I hope that they overall address the issues to where at least you could have a lead on to further research. And I always encourage you to do that. Wishing everybody well and a good evening. Kol tuv.
Thank you so much.